Dear Indian friends, greetings from Bell'Italia 88 and welcome back. I am Caterina Brazzi Castracane, I am an historian and I am here in collaboration with the Italian Cultural Center in New Delhi. Today in particular I am here to share with you the first appointment of this year dedicated to the rediscovery of the Italian city of Ravenna. And actually I have to say that it's a pleasure to start this new year talking about this small city in the north part of Italy, a small city that could be considered a sort of pearl of arts. A small city full of masterpieces and with an important and huge history. So important that during the centuries, as we are going to discover together, Ravenna has been capital of several kingdoms and empires. This huge history probably started in the moment when Italic people decided to move southward from the area around the city of Aquileia, city that you can recognize in this part of the map, while Ravenna is here in the north part of Italy, not so far from Bologna. And it's certain that in historical times the city was occupied by the Etruscans, and we can also deduce this element just reading the suffix n inside the name of the city, because that kind of suffix was typically Etruscan. Later, in 191, the city came under Roman control and it quickly was transformed into an important center of powers. But there is actually an important moment when the history of this city really changed. The moment when the Emperor Augustus decided to build 5 kilometers from the city the important port of Classis, an important harbor destined to be the perfect base for the naval fleet of Rome in the Adriatic Sea, and also the perfect sign of the power and the pride of Ravenna. Sign destined to be transformed into something else, into something that is linked with the iconographical themes that is possible still today find inside buildings and churches in the historic center of Ravenna. In particular, using this imaging, you are seeing the mosaical representation of the port of Classis that is housed inside the church of Santa Polinare Nuovo, one of the most remarkable monuments in this city. But looking to the history of Ravenna, there is another moment that could be really considered as the turning point for the destiny of this city. The year 402 AD, year when the Emperor Honorius, in this case, Honorius' death before had been forced to abandon Milan because of the Visigoth invasion, decided to transfer the capital of the Western Roman Empire from Milan to Ravenna. And since that moment, the city was chosen as a capital 2 more times. First of all, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, as the capital of the Ostrogoths, and in particular the capital of King Theoderic, one of the myths of Ravenna. And eventually, the city was chosen again by the Emperor Justinian, who really decided to transform this city in the perfect place full of the influences of the Byzantine Empire inside the Italic peninsula. The most remarkable aspect linked with the history in Ravenna is that the history is still visible, just discovering the amazing cultural heritage of this city that is partially listed by UNESCO inside the heritage of humanity. You have to understand that during that centuries, between the Roman age to the Byzantine time, the city was transformed several times to be the perfect icon of a modern capital. And in particular, in Ravenna were built important examples of buildings and churches that today are the perfect representation of that blend between the Hellenic Roman tradition and the Byzantine suggestion arrived from Constantinople. But Ravenna is also something else because it's a city with a specific link with literature. Because this is the city where the poet Dante Alighieri spent the last part of his life, the city where he died in 1321, and the city that during the modern age was rediscovered by other authors, writers, and in general artists who really generated the myth of this city. During the 19th century, in particular, Lord Byron or Oscar Wilde created the myth of Ravenna according to the romantic taste of that period. But after them, Sigmund Freud and eventually Gustav Klimt really transformed this small city in a sort of huge myth of our past. Klimt, in particular, who spent part of his life in Ravenna in 1903, really was transformed just seeing the amazing mosaical decoration inside churches and buildings. And he decided to reuse the as ancient technique to create the masterpieces that we know. And the city of Ravenna is linked with this artist because inside one important museum, the so-named MAR, Museum of Art of Ravenna, there is this drawing by Gustav Klimt realized after the period he spent in this city. Just walking inside the historic centers, we can find different examples of the heritage of the past. And we can start discovering this important heritage with the last discovery of the municipality of Ravenna, the so-named Domus of stone carpex, a sort of perfect reinterpretation of a domus built during the Roman age and completely decorated with mosaics. In this case, using this virtual reconstruction of the domus, we can understand that what the important superintendents of the archaeological heritage really discovered was a complex of 14 rooms completely decorated with mosaics used as was in accord with the taste of that time to cover the floors of the house. And in particular inside this museum we can find important example of geometrical patterns and figures realized to adorn these spaces. Today, this museum is hidden under the floor of this church dedicated to Santa Eufemia because the mosaics were restored and replaced on the original places, and in particular among the amazing example of mosaics we can discover together these dance dedicated to the seasons that is one of the most important example of mosaics created to adorn this space, where you can recognize in this case three figures: the winter on the top, the autumn on the bottom, and the spring on the left side, that are here dancing in front of this musician that is a sort of icon of the taste of the time. But is an example of mosaics created during the Roman period were the inspiration for other kind of buildings. In particular, the inspiration to create some modern examples of churches completely decorated with this technique. And in particular, among these monuments, one of the most important is the so-named Mausoleum of Galapagos, a sort of small and apparently undistinguished building built reusing Roman bricks and created, according to the legend, for the will of the sister of the Emperor Honorius. Galla Placidia has her own resting place. The historians tell us that it was never used for that purpose, even because the empress died and was buried in Rome in 450. But maybe this building, as you can see using this imaging, was realized to be part of the narthex in front of another church, the church dedicated to the Holy Cross, and also realized for the will of the Empress. This should be the mausoleum, this the narthex, and this the church. Today, this building is a sort of simple building from the outside, but is a sort of amazing celebration of color and faith from the inside, because all the building was completely decorated with mosaics, and all the space is even brighter by the golden light that filtering through this example of alabaster window. In particular, the interior decoration was realized to occupy all the space of the mausoleum, and the walls were covered in the lower part with marble slabs, and over them amazing mosaics realized to cover all the space, including the lunettes and the vault. In this case, the iconographical theme realized inside the mausoleum was inspired by both Hellenic, Roman, and Christian tradition. In particular, the aim of this important decoration is related with the triumph of faith, and the mausoleum was realized to celebrate the victory of eternal life over death. The decoration is articulated in different scenes that could be read from the bottom upwards, and the top is represented by this golden cross that is surrounded by this sky full of golden stars and by four living creatures created as the symbol of the evangelists. In particular, the star was pointing eastward because it was believed that Jesus will come from east to restore the life to the death. And we can find also two other crosses inside this huge decoration, inside this small building. First of all, the cross in the scene that is represented over the entrance door, a scene that was taken from the Gospel of John, dedicated to Christ as the Good Shepherd. And in this case, you can see Christ birdless, surrounded by sheep that are just the metaphorical reinterpretation of humanity. The third cross inside this mausoleum is depicted inside the scene dedicated to St. Lawrence, in this case represented while running towards martyrdom and with the cross with himself, but also this scene was created to celebrate the power of the word of God that is still visible with the Gospels realized inside this small cabinet. Not far from the Mausoleum of Galapagos, in the other part of the garden, we find the huge Basilica of Sanvital, maybe the real masterpiece of Byzantine architecture in Ravenna. The church is especially noted for the colorful mosaics realized to decorate the interior, and we also know that it was realized during the reign of the Emperor Justinian, with some specific link with Constantinople. In fact, the church was realized when the bishop Ecclesius came back from Constantinople and was also financed by the Greek banker Julianus L'Argentario. The church was consecrated later with the bishop Maximinian, and all these characters are represented with mosaics inside the interior decoration of the church, and basically the church was thought to be quite similar to another example of a church built during the same time in Constantinople. I am talking about the church dedicated to the saints Sergius and Bacchus, and as you can see using this picture, the two churches in the lower part of the slide, you are seeing the church in Constantinople, or today Istanbul, and in the higher part you are seeing Sanvital. The churches are really similar from the outside, but completely different from the inside. In particular, the church was completely decorated with mosaics in part of the apse, the walls of presbytery, and on the triumphal arch. And the aim of this huge decoration is link with Christ, because we can find for 3 times the figures of Christ in this space. First of all, in the middle of the introduction of this triumphal arch, later in the center of the lunette and in the center of the apse. In particular, the first representation of Christ is of him, in this case with the birth, among the apostles, and in particular among Paulus and Peter's, that are considered the touchable pilasters of the Catholic Church of Rome. The second representation of Christ is linked with the idea of the Agnus Dei, and in particular in this case the representation of Christ is surrounded by figures of angels and animals to celebrate the power of God and the possibility to live after death. But the most important representation of Christ is the last one, is Christ as the cosmocrator or ruler of the world, because in this case he is sitting on an important globe that should be the representation of earth, around him angels, but also the bishop Ecclesius, that is giving with his right hand to Christ the model of the Church of Sanvital. But this important celebration of God is also related with the celebration of power, and in particular of the celebration of the empire. In fact, we can discover that on the lower part of the apse we can find two more mosaics realized to be a perfect representation of the imperial character of that moment, the character of Justinian, the emperor, that are here depicted to be part of this important and religious procession to God. In particular, Justinian is here represented with an important part of his court, including soldiers, diacons, but also other important characters as the bishop Maximinian, the man who really consecrated the Church of Sanvital. Justinian holds a large golden paten which he offers in the direction of Christ, and differently to the other figures, he is not turned towards Christ, but rather faces outward. He is in front of us, or in that case, in front of his wife, the Empress Theodora. Theodora is here depicted with the court, and in particular in the first part of this mosaical celebration you can find this man that probably was an eunuch that is here portrayed while he is opening the curtain and while he is looking towards the empress. In front of them there is this important fountain that is a sort of reinterpretation of that Roman iconographical elements that we can find in other example of Domus, as the Domus of the stone carpet, and the beauty of the Empress is something amazing, something that really is a sort of celebration of female beauty, so adorned with these important jewels to be the most remarkable icon of the richness of the past. It's probably that these mosaic really influenced the artist Gustav Klimt, so to transform the aim of his work, also influencing the representation of this lady Adele Bloch-Bauer, realized, according to some historians, with elements similar to the Empress Theodora, and so a sort of reinterpretation of that kind of beauty, thought and realized not in the ancient time but during the 20th century. But this church was also realized with a peculiar design, not realized with the traditional plan of nave and two aisles, but realized around an octagonal plan topped by a dome that rests on 8 pilasters and arches. In this case, the dome not was covered with mosaics, but just realized with frescoes at the end of the 18th century. And all that elements linked with the color of the mosaics, the color of the frescoes, and the natural light that enters inside the dome from these important windows was used to celebrate the power of God, and also to transform this important temple in a sort of metaphysical reinterpretation of a church, where everything is related with detachable manifestation of God. But there is also another important church inside the historic center of Ravenna, the church of Santa Polinare Nuovo, surname to distinguish it from another namesake small church in the city. But originally, this church was realized for the will of the Emperor Theoderic during the first part of the 6th century, and realized to be the private Palatine chapel of his palace. During that time, the church was consecrated to the Arian religion, because that was the religion of the king of Ostrogoth. But later, in around 560, the church was converted into the Catholic one and dedicated to St. Martin de Tours. Later, when it was decided to transfer the remains of Santa Polinare from the church of Santa Polinare in Classe near the port realized by the Emperor Augustus to this church inside the historic center of Ravenna, the church was named to Santa Polinare. And in particular, all this important building was realized to be completely decorated with mosaics in all the different parts of the church. But today, the basilica is famed just for these important two-side walls full of figurative mosaics realized from the time of the King Theoderic to the time of the Emperor Justinian. And in this case, we are talking about these important mosaics because they are the only the part that survive during the centuries of the original building of this church. In particular, this decoration could be read in three different tiers, and also it could be read from the top down. The starting point is the upper band that was completely realized during the age of Theodoric to be linked to the figures of Christ with 13 panels on the left wall decorated with scenes in link to the miracles of Christ, and with other 13 panels on the opposite side linked with the period of the Passion of Christ. There are a lot of differences inside these mosaics. In particular, in the scene of the miracle, you can see Christ has the poor, the young man, birthless, linked with the idea of the possibility of the power of God. On the opposite side, inside the scene that really represented the Passion of Christ, we can see another interpretation of the body of Christ with a birth sense of experience and also of human pain, style that is linked with the dramatical events that took place during the last part of the life of Christ. The second tier of this huge mosaical decoration was also realized during the age of Theodoric, and is basically related to the representation of biblical figures, probably prophets, alternating with windows. And all the figures were realized by painter arrived from Constantinople, and each one is here realized with different kind of items and symbols, including the wonderful book that you can see using the imaging on the left side of the screen. The third tier is completely remade during the Byzantine period, and is maybe the well-known mosaical decoration of the Church of Ravenna. In particular, you have to imagine to be in the center of the nave and seeing the left wall and the right wall. On the left wall, you can find a long procession of 22 virgins led by 3 kings emerging from the port of Classis, the starting point of this conference, towards the Madonna with child. On the right wall, we can also see another kind of procession, in this case full of martyrs, led from the palace of Theodoric towards Christ, surrounded by angels. All these series were realized to be a sort of rhythmical dance in front of God, Christ in one part, and in front of the Theotokos Virgin. Theotokos just means the Mother of God. And in particular, we can here discover elements taken from the normal habits of the Byzantine court, including the proskenesis, these typical ritual art so popular inside the Byzantine courts and traditionally reserved for the emperors. The mages are here depicted as a sort of the rich king of religion, the rich men that are here to give a lot of different presents to God. But also is interesting for us to notice that these important celebration started with this representation of the Palazium of the King Theoderic, palace that is not possible to see in Ravenna because it was completely destroyed during the centuries. As you can see that this part of the mosaic was partially deleted by the Byzantine to transform the original one in something else, but we can find some traces of the original decoration just seeing the hands of characters deleted and transformed in part of this building. Why this was possible? Because the King Theodoric was object of a sort of damnatio memoriae after his death, and we could also understand this aspect discovering the mausoleum of this king, realized in accord to the tradition of that time, not inside the city but outside of it, in a part of the city destinated to the Gothic burial, and realized to be the perfect icon of the power of the king of Ostrogoth. The King Theodoric is important for the history of Ravenna. He was the man who won the King Odoacer, the man who really ruled the city of Ravenna for the first time with a population composed by both Roman and Goth. And this is one of the reasons why this mausoleum is so important for the heritage of this city. But this is not the only reason why it is, because this complicated structure was realized completely using Istrian stone and dividing the structure into decagonal orders placed one on the top of the other. In particular, the upper level is topped by this huge monolithic dome that weighs around 230 tons, and is believed that this stone was carved from a single piece of Istrian stone. The strange aspect is that the historians ignore how these giant stones were placed in this position. And there is another strange thing. The structure inside is composed by two spaces, and there is no possibility to reach the second floor from the inside. inside. The only possibility to arrive to the second floor is just using this external staircase, in this case a modern staircase that let us enter inside the mausoleum to discover this porphyry tab where probably Theoderic was buried. Why I'm saying probably? Because after Justinian's edict in 561, also this mausoleum was turned into an Orthodox oratory, and we no have ideas of the original decoration that could be imagined were present inside it. But in Ravenna there is another important neoclassical monument or mausoleum, the tomb of the poet Dante, realized in this case for the will Luigi Valenti Gonzaga at the end of the 18th century to give a new kind of nobility and decency to the Dante's tomb, and realized by the hand of Camillo Morigia. This important and white mausoleum is in the center of that part of Ravenna, called the silent area, the Zona del Silenzio, an area completely dedicated to the history of the great poet. As we know, Dante died in Ravenna on 14 September of 1321 after having contracted malaria, returning from Venice, where he was for the will of Guido Novello da Polenta, Lord of Ravenna during that time, but also the host of Dante during his exile from Florence. And the important funeral of the poet was celebrated inside this church dedicated to St. Francis. Actually, it's important to remember that to celebrate this funeral was chosen this church because it was the favorite of the Polentani family, and also it's possible that the poet himself used to be a regular visitor of the church. But the church that we can admire today is not the original one realized in the middle of the 5th century, but is an important re-edification realized after the 9th century and dominated by these important square bell towers. The church was dedicated to the San Francis in honor of the Franciscan friars that used to live in a monastery linked with this church. In this case, we have not a lot of the original decoration thought and realized for this church, but is also important because it's an example of that characteristic of Ravenna, where sometimes the original floor of buildings and church is lower than the current street level, and in particular just through a window beneath the main altar we can discover this crypt that was realized to be the perfect room to hold the relics of the Bishop Neon, the man who consecrated this church, crypt that is completely covered with traces of the huge mosaical decoration of the floor that is constantly submerged by water, and there are also some red fishes inside. But this church is also important for us because in 1949 the Franciscan friars returned to Ravenna and returned to this church for the will of the Archbishop of that time, Giacomo Lercaro, and they decided to celebrate the important poet Dante Alighieri, creating this important center of studying about him, the so-named Centro Dantesco dei Frati Minori. The center was realized for the will of another friar, Father Severino Ragazzini, who decided to create an important library destined to the studies about Dante, but also one part of the Museum Dantesco that still today is open to us to discover a lot of elements linked with the poet. But the link between the Franciscan friars and Dante is too important than this modern relationship, because actually we have to say that originally the body of Dante was conserved inside an important sarcophagus in front of the Church of San Francisco, and everything was peaceful until the moment when the Pope Leo X, son of Lawrence the Magnificent, decided to move the remains of Dante to Florence. In that moment, Ravenna had no possibility to say nothing to the Pope, because during the 16th century, Ravenna was part of the estate of the Roman Church. So there is no possibility to not upset the will of the Pope. But finally, something strange happened, because when the ambassadors arrived to Ravenna and opened the tomb, they found it empty. There was any trace of the remains of Dante. For 2 centuries, the remains were given for lost. Since the year 1865, when workers that were tearing down a piece of a wall near the chapel of Bacchus found a wooden box with the written Dante's Ossa. So in that moment, the truth came out. And the reality was that in that year, the 1519, the monks, in order to prevent the ambassadors from taking the remains of the poet, had made a hole on the tomb's side, had taken the remains and hidden them inside the cloister. Then they had kept it as a secret. The problem later arrived when, in 1810, because of the Napoleonic Code, the monks had been forced to leave the cloister. But before doing it, they decided to hidden again the box in a wall of Quadrarco di Bracciaforte, wall that was destroyed in that year 1865, and where the box was found. At that moment, the remains of Dante were transferred inside the perfect temple realized by the Murrigia, but even in this case, just for a short time, because during the Second World War, the remains were hidden again under the floor to protect them by the dramatic events that around Europe took place during that moment. Now Dante really rests inside the mausoleum, but actually we have to say that the Florentines still reclaim the body. In particular, this here, because we are celebrating the anniversary of the poet's death. We will see what happened during this year 2021. So I ended with this aspect, this conference. I stopped sharing my screen to say thank you very much to you for your attention, and I hope we will see again to discover together other important cities of Italy. Thank you very much and see you the next time. Bye bye.